The crime scene tape went up on a Tuesday. 5 weeks after Lynette Hooker vanished from the waters of the Abaco Islands, federal agents stretched yellow tape around the perimeter of a 46-foot sailing vessel and officially declared it what investigators had suspected since nearly the beginning: a crime scene. The boat is named Soulmate. The irony of that name has not been lost on anyone following this case. And what happened inside that boat, according to the evidence now being processed in a federal laboratory, may be the thing that finally brings this investigation to its conclusion. This is the Crime Files. No sensationalism, no exploitation, just evidence, just analysis, just the pursuit of truth. There is a particular kind of silence that follows when a woman disappears and the man who was supposed to bring her home does not. It is not the silence of absence. It is the silence of unanswered questions, of phone calls that go unreturned, of a stepdaughter who has not heard a single word from the man who raised her, of a mother who wakes up every morning still not knowing where her daughter is. That is the silence surrounding the case of Lynette Hooker, and it has lasted long enough. The evidence collected from Soulmate during the federal search warrant execution may finally be the thing that breaks it. Lynette Hooker was a live-aboard sailor. For 4 years, she and her husband Brian called a 46-foot sloop their home. They moved through the Atlantic. They anchored in the Bahamas. They documented their life with the kind of candid joy that made strangers feel invested in them as people. She had a daughter named Carly. She had a mother named Darlene. She had an aquamarine bathing suit cover-up she wore on the water, and a royal blue headscarf she tied around her head when the wind came up, and an Apple Watch with a powder pink wristband that she put on the charger every night when she got back to the boat. These are not incidental details. These details are at the center of why investigators believe what they believe about what happened to her. On the day she disappeared, she and Brian had spent the afternoon at Tahiti Beach on Elbow Key in the Abaco Island chain. It was a beautiful day. Multiple independent witnesses confirmed this. Families were out. Children were in dinghies. The water was calm and clear on the bay side of the Barrier Islands. At approximately 4:30 in the afternoon, Brian and Lynette left the Abaco Inn, a marina and restaurant on Elbow Key, and headed back towards Soulmate, which was anchored nearby in Aunt Pat's Bay. What happened next, according to Brian Hooker, was a tragedy. What happened next, according to the evidence now emerging from the federal investigation, may have been something else entirely. Brian told investigators that somewhere between 7:30 and 7:45 that evening, while he and Lynette were in their small, inflatable dinghy making the short passage back to Soulmate, Lynette went overboard. He described the conditions at that moment as rough, wind-driven, the kind of water that a small inflatable dinghy cannot safely maneuver in. He said he tried to reach her. He said the current took her away from him. He said he was swept 4 miles across the Sea of Abaco to Marsh Harbor, and that it took him 9 hours to get there. He told the search teams who responded that Lynette had been wearing a black 2-piece bathing suit. She was wearing an aquamarine cover-up, a royal blue headscarf, possibly a black fanny pack with a lime green dry bag. None of that description was provided to the people who searched the Sea of Abaco for days based on what they had been told. The search parameters were built on a description that did not match reality and on weather conditions that witnesses, photographs, and weather data have since demonstrated were nothing like what Brian described. The sea was calm. The conditions were benign. The story does not survive contact with the facts it was supposed to explain, and the sea gave nothing back. Not a garment, not a personal item, not any physical trace of any kind that could be connected to Lynette Hooker. This is not what happens when a person enters the Sea of Abaco. The water is shallow, in most places between 4 and 15 feet, and exceptionally clear. The bottom is visible from the surface across enormous stretches of it. The shorelines were searched extensively using predictive modeling based on tide patterns and wind direction. In the experience of maritime search professionals, a person who enters this body of water does not disappear without leaving something behind. Clothing fibers, a shoe, a piece of equipment, something. The absence of any trace at all is, by itself, a forensic statement. Lynette Hooker is not in the Sea of Abaco. She is somewhere else. The United States Coast Guard Investigative Service has been running a criminal investigation into her disappearance since early in the case. CGIS is not a general-purpose law enforcement agency. These are specialists in maritime crime, in homicides that happen on the water, in the forensic analysis of vessels and the digital evidence that modern boats generate in extraordinary quantities. When CGIS opens a criminal investigation, it is because the evidence supports the conclusion that a crime has occurred. They do not commit those resources to accidents. The interdiction of Soulmate was the first major public development in the investigation. The vessel was located off the coast of Florida, intercepted by a Coast Guard cutter, and towed into port before it could be taken to a jurisdiction where executing a search warrant would become significantly more complicated. The decision to interdict was deliberate. It was based on an assessment that the boat contained evidence that needed to be preserved and examined under controlled conditions. You do not interdict a sailboat on a casual suspicion. You do it because you have articulable, documented reasons to believe that what is inside that boat matters to a federal criminal case. Then the warrant came. A federal judge reviewed the affidavit submitted by CGIS investigators, evaluated the probable cause, and signed the order authorizing the search. Probable cause is a legal threshold. It is not low. The fact that the warrant was granted means that the information investigators had assembled before they ever boarded Soulmate was already sufficient to meet that standard. What they found during the search may take the case substantially further. The agents worked methodically. They wore blue nitrile examination gloves. They set up a processing table on the dock. They moved through the vessel section by section, removing items, sealing them in evidence envelopes and bags marked clearly with the word evidence, logging each item in a chain of custody record that will follow that evidence all the way to a courtroom, if that is where this case ends up. Chain of custody is not a formality. It is the mechanism by which physical evidence survives cross-examination. Every seal, every signature, every log entry is a link that a defense attorney will attempt to break. CGIS agents sealed those links carefully. Crime scene tape went up before the end of the day. The boat is now legally and operationally a crime scene. It will not be released. Investigators can return and continue processing. Everything aboard Soulmate is protected under the authority of a federal criminal investigation that has not ended and will not end until the picture is complete. What came off that boat is the question that will eventually answer everything. The Starlink satellite internet system mounted on the mast of Soulmate is one of the most significant pieces of potential evidence in this investigation. Starlink provides satellite-based internet connectivity to devices aboard the boat through a network that paired devices connect to automatically when they come within range. Both Brian and Lynette carried smartphones. Both wore smartwatches connected to those phones. The moment either of them came within signal range of Soulmate's Starlink antenna, their devices would have connected. That connection event is logged with a timestamp. It is stored on Starlink's servers. Federal investigators with appropriate legal process can compel those records to be produced. If Lynette's phone or watch connected to Soulmate's home network at any point after 7:45 on the evening she disappeared, that timestamp directly contradicts the account of a drowning that Brian Hooker told investigators had already occurred by that time. The battery management system aboard Soulmate is a forensic diary of everything that happened electrically on that boat. Soulmate's original battery installation had been replaced within the last 2 years. New marine battery systems of that generation include usage logging as a standard feature. Every draw of electrical current is recorded with the time at which it occurred. The refrigerator cycling, a cabin light activating, the water pump engaging when a tap is opened, a device connecting to a charging outlet. These events leave time-stamped entries in the log. The refrigerator and the freezer will show as consistent background activity regardless of whether anyone is aboard. What investigators are looking for are the anomalies, events that should not be occurring if the boat was empty during the hours Brian Hooker claims no one was there. Lynette Hooker had a consistent habit, described in detail by her daughter Carly, who had witnessed it during a visit to the boat. When Lynette returned from a day on the water, she would shower to wash the salt off, change into dry clothes, and put her Apple Watch on the charger because the battery would be depleted after a full day of use. These are exactly the kinds of actions that leave electrical signatures in a battery management log. The water pump, the outlet current draw from a charging watch, the cabin light. If those events appear in the log during the window when Brian Hooker's account places no one aboard the vessel, the log is contradicting his account with the precision of a machine that has no reason to lie. The Apple Watch found aboard Soulmate, with its powder pink wristband, is a piece of evidence that extends beyond the physical object itself. Apple Watch devices synchronize health and location data continuously to iCloud when connected to a paired phone or a Wi-Fi network. The health data collected by an Apple Watch includes continuous heart rate monitoring, movement tracking, GPS location records when connected to a phone with active location services, and physiological measurements that are recorded at regular intervals throughout the day. The last entry in that data stream, the last recorded heartbeat, the last detected movement, can establish with the confidence of continuous machine measurement when Lynette Hooker's watch was last receiving her biological signals. That data exists on Apple's servers. It is recoverable under subpoena. It is the kind of evidence that has been introduced in criminal cases before and that juries understand intuitively, because everyone wearing a smartwatch understands that the device knows things about your body that you may not consciously track yourself. The security camera system aboard Soulmate is potentially the most direct evidence available. Cameras mounted under the bimini of the cockpit were confirmed by people who had been aboard the vessel. Security cameras on a live-aboard sailboat are installed for a specific and rational purpose. When your home is a boat floating in an open anchorage accessible to anyone with a small watercraft, security monitoring is a practical necessity. Pirates exist in the Bahamas and throughout the Caribbean. They are not a metaphor. Boats have been boarded, crews have been robbed at gunpoint, equipment has been stolen from vessels while owners slept below. Brian and Lynette Hooker had cameras. They had motion-activated trigger lights mounted in the rigging. They had security measures in place because they understood the risk of living in an environment that could not be locked from the inside like a house on a street. Those cameras, if motion-activated, would have recorded every approach to Soulmate, every boarding, every event on the deck during the evening hours. If those cameras were connected to a cloud storage service, which many modern security camera systems are as a default feature, the footage does not reside only on hardware that could be wiped or damaged or lost. It exists on a server maintained by the manufacturer or the storage service associated with the account. That footage is subpoenable. Federal investigators with appropriate warrants can obtain it from the cloud service regardless of what happened to the camera hardware aboard the boat. If that footage shows two people boarding Soulmate from a dinghy at any point after 7:45 on the evening of Lynette's disappearance, the core of Brian Hooker's account disintegrates. There is one more category of potential evidence from the boat that deserves specific attention. Among the items visible during the processing of the search warrant, observers noted what appeared to be a large bladed instrument recovered from below decks. A knife with a blade style described by those who glimpsed it as substantial, the kind of blade that a live-aboard sailor might keep for practical purposes or for security. The presence of a large knife aboard a sailing vessel is not inherently suspicious. Sailors carry blades. They use them for practical tasks, and they keep larger ones for security against exactly the kind of threat that motivated the installation of the cameras and the trigger lights. But a bladed instrument removed from a vessel during a federal criminal investigation, sealed in an evidence bag, and sent to a forensic laboratory for analysis becomes something very different from a piece of sailing equipment. The laboratory will look for biological material on and in the blade. It will look for trace evidence in the handle. It will look for any forensic signature that connects that instrument to Lynette Hooker. The results of that analysis will either be significant or they will not, but they will be definitive. Now turn to the geography of what may have happened after. If Lynette Hooker was not taken by the Sea of Abaco, she is on land. And if she was placed on land by someone who needed to move quickly, in the dark, using only the tools available aboard a sailing vessel, the physical constraints of that situation significantly narrow the possibilities. The dinghy carried by Soulmate had an electric motor. Dinghies of that type, at low speed to conserve battery and minimize noise, travel at approximately 2 to 4 miles per hour. The primary battery had been in use throughout the day. The spare battery was additional reserve. If Soulmate's battery logs show that the dinghy's charging system was drawing current during the evening hours, that would indicate the dinghy battery was being recharged aboard the boat during a window before a nighttime departure. From Aunt Pat's Bay, at low dinghy speed with a charged battery and a spare in reserve, the operational range covers several candidate locations: the quiet western shore of Lubbers Quarters, the remote beaches on the Atlantic side of the Tahiti Beach Formation, the approach to Hopetown Harbor, and the mangrove zones on its western edge. The abandoned grounds of Snapper Point Marina north of Marsh Harbor, where Lynette and Brian had been documented by their own social media in February of that year. Each of these locations shares a set of characteristics. They are within dinghy range of the anchorage. They are significantly less trafficked than the popular tourist areas. They have been visited by Brian and Lynette during their time in the Abacos, meaning Brian would have known them in daylight and could have navigated toward them in darkness with reasonable confidence. And they present the kind of terrain that, while not ideal for the purpose of concealment, would be the best available option within the operational constraints of an unplanned nighttime operation conducted by one person with limited equipment. The western shore of Lubbers Quarters has received the most focused attention from volunteer searchers and local experts. Lubbers Quarters is a small key positioned between Marsh Harbor and Elbow Key. Its eastern shore faces the anchorage area where Soulmate was moored and has permanent residents, some of whom maintained surveillance cameras pointed across the water. Those cameras recorded light events during the nighttime hours of Lynette's disappearance. Patterns of illumination consistent with motion-activated lights on a vessel, and a small watercraft moving in proximity to it in the dark. The western shore of Lubbers Quarters is different in character. It faces Marsh Harbor, It is largely uninhabited. The beaches are narrow and backed by low scrub and limestone. Volunteers who searched those beaches on foot documented terrain that would be challenging to move through in complete darkness, but passable for someone with a light source and prior knowledge of the approach. Lynette and Brian had been to those shores. Their social media record contains images that people with knowledge of the area have identified as consistent with the backside of Luber's quarters. He would not have been navigating blind. The Snapper Point location carries its own weight in this analysis. It is documented. They were there together in February. The property is abandoned. The buildings collapsed by Hurricane Dorian. The grounds overgrown in the years since the storm. It is not a place that people visit without a specific reason. If you needed a location that you knew from personal experience, that was within dinghy range, that was unlikely to have foot traffic, and that you could reach in darkness with a reasonable expectation of not being observed, Snapper Point is a rational choice by the logic of the situation. The mangrove zones near Hopetown present a different kind of concealment. You do not need to dig in a mangrove. The vegetation itself provides concealment that is dense, nearly impenetrable to casual foot traffic, and capable of retaining things placed within it for extended periods. Against that advantage stands one significant forensic reality. Cadaver detection dogs trained for water recovery work can identify the olfactory signature of decomposing organic material from the surface of a water body. The oils produced during decomposition migrate upward through the water column and concentrate at the surface, where a trained detection dog can detect them from distances of up to 30 feet. A body in a water body associated with a mangrove environment, even a body at significant depth, cannot hide from a properly equipped search team working from a vessel. The detail of the missing oar is one that investigators have noted. Brian Hooker reported losing an oar from the dinghy during the incident. He said the oar lock pin broke and the oar went into the water. An oar was subsequently reported found on the eastern shore of Luber's quarters by a local resident. Whether that oar has been forensically examined and whether it can be connected to Soulmate's dinghy is not publicly known, but an oar is relevant to this case in a specific way. It is one of the few implements available aboard a small, inflatable dinghy that could function as a digging tool on a sandy beach. Not efficiently, not easily, but in a situation where efficiency and ease are unavailable. An oar is what you have. If that oar was used and then buried with or near the victim, or if it was left at a site and subsequently recovered by tidal action, it becomes a piece of physical evidence with potential forensic value that connects a specific object to a specific location and a specific person. Brian Hooker left the Bahamas. He said he would not. He said it directly. He said it in front of people who heard him and who have not forgotten what he said. Within hours of that statement, he departed. He traveled to Northern California, where his mother and sister live. His sister had traveled to the Bahamas to be with him during the active search period. He has not contacted Carly, who has been his stepdaughter since she was 3 years old, who grew up in his household, who is now grieving the loss of her mother and the simultaneous disappearance of the man she called her stepfather. He has not contacted Darlene, Lynette's mother. He has not issued any public statement of grief or loss. He has not participated in any memorial effort. He has not made any public appeal for continued search efforts. He obtained legal counsel and went silent. This behavior is documented. It is observable. And while behavior alone does not constitute evidence of a crime, behavior in the context of a totality of evidence tells a story that investigators are trained to read. The geometry of what Brian Hooker did after Lynette disappeared does not fit the geometry of a man whose wife drowned in an accident he witnessed and could not prevent. It fits a different geometry. And the forensic evidence being analyzed in a federal laboratory right now will either confirm that geometry or dismantle it. There is no middle position. The evidence will say what it says, and it will say it to investigators who have the training and the resources to understand every word of it. The investigation being conducted by CGIS is not operating on a timeline defined by public interest or media coverage. It is operating on the timeline required to build a case that survives a federal prosecution. That is a different and longer timeline, one measured in the completeness of the forensic picture rather than in the urgency of public expectation. Federal prosecutors do not charge cases. They are not confident they can win. CGIS investigators do not submit charging recommendations until the evidence is assembled and analyzed and understood well enough to present to a grand jury and, ultimately, to a trial jury. The patience required for that process is difficult for the people who loved Lynette Hooker. It is the process that gives justice its weight. Carly has not stopped asking. Darlene has not stopped searching. The community of people who met Lynette during 4 years of sailing the Bahamas, who followed her life online, who responded when she disappeared with the kind of mobilization that only happens when a person has genuinely touched the lives of the people around her, has not stopped. Volunteer searchers are still walking remote beaches. Local residents with boats are still making runs to the quiet shores that tourists never see. People with knowledge of the Abaco terrain are still sharing what they know with anyone who might be able to use it. The official tip line maintained by CGIS accepts anonymous submissions through a dedicated application, and investigators have said that every piece of information matters because every piece of information adds to the picture. The picture is becoming clearer. The evidence bags are sealed. The federal laboratory is working. The Starlink records exist somewhere on a server waiting to be read by someone with a subpoena. The battery log aboard Soulmate contains a time-stamped record of everything that happened electrically on that boat during the hours in question. Lynette's Apple Watch data is preserved in a cloud account that a federal warrant can access. The security camera footage, if it went to the cloud, is there waiting. And somewhere in the Abacos, on a beach or in a mangrove or on the grounds of an abandoned resort property, there may be physical remains that will tell the last part of the story that the digital evidence cannot. When all of those pieces come together, and they will come together, the full weight of what was done will be visible, not as a theory, not as a suspicion, as a documented, forensically supported, legally proven account of what happened to a woman who spent 4 years sailing with the man she trusted, and who deserved to grow old watching the sunsets she had spent those 4 years collecting. Lynette Hooker deserves to be found. She deserves to be brought home to the people who love her. She deserves justice. And the people working this case, the federal agents in blue gloves sealing evidence bags on a dock in Florida, the volunteers walking remote beaches in the Abacos, the daughter and the mother who have not given up and will not give up, are all moving toward the same thing. There is a category of evidence that receives less public discussion than the cameras and the battery logs and the Apple Watch, but that is equally important to understanding the full scope of what investigators are working with. Cellular records. Both Brian and Lynette Hooker carried smartphones. Cellular service providers maintain detailed records of when a device connects to a tower, which tower it connects to, the strength and angle of that connection, and what data activity the device produces during the connection. These tower records are not GPS coordinates in the precise sense, but they provide a geographic picture of where a device was at any given time, particularly in an area like the Abacos where the number of available towers is limited and the geometry of signal triangulation is relatively precise. If Lynette's phone connected to a cell tower after 7:45 on the evening of her disappearance, that connection tells investigators where the phone was at that moment. If the phone went completely dark at a specific time and has produced no signal of any kind since, that silence has its own forensic significance. The moment a phone stops transmitting is a moment that investigators note carefully, because it may correspond to the moment its owner was no longer capable of using it. The financial dimensions of this case have been noted by people who have been following it closely, though the specific details are not publicly available in a form that permits precise conclusions. When a couple lives aboard a jointly owned vessel and one partner disappears, the financial implications are substantial and specific. A sailing vessel of Soulmate's size and type represents a significant asset. Life insurance policies, if they exist between the parties, become immediately relevant to an investigation. The disposition of jointly held property in the context of a disappearance at sea, where no body has been recovered and no official determination of cause of death has been made, is legally complex and can remain unresolved for extended periods. Investigators examining the full context of a case involving a missing spouse will always look at the financial picture, not because financial motive is sufficient to prove anything, but because it contributes to the overall portrait of the circumstances surrounding the event. It is one more piece of the mosaic. There is also the question of what happened in the days immediately before Lynette's disappearance. The weeks and months preceding a violent incident in a close relationship frequently contain observable patterns that become visible in retrospect. Communications between the parties, changes in behavior or routine, unusual purchases, statements made to friends or family that, in the context of what happened later, carry a significance that was not apparent at the time. The people who knew Brian and Lynette, who were in contact with them during their time in the Abacos, who interacted with them at anchorages and marinas and restaurants and beach gatherings, are a source of this contextual information. Investigators conducting thorough interviews with members of the cruising community who had contact with the Hookers in the period leading up to the disappearance will have gathered a substantial volume of this material. What that material shows is not yet public, but it is part of the investigation. The relationship between Brian and Lynette, as visible through 4 years of documented social media activity and through the accounts of people who knew them personally, presented an image of a couple living an adventurous and largely joyful life. That image is the one that Lynette's friends and followers knew. Whether it fully represented the private reality of their relationship is a question that investigators will have examined carefully. The people closest to Lynette, including Carly, have been cooperative with the investigation. The picture they have provided of the relationship, of its dynamics, of the tensions that existed within it, has informed the investigative direction in ways that are not fully visible from the outside. But the behavioral evidence after the disappearance, Brian's failure to contact Lynette's family, his rapid departure from the Bahamas, his silence, his legal representation, is consistent with a person who knows that the closer investigators look at that relationship, the more difficult his position becomes. The volunteers who have been involved in the ground search deserve specific recognition for the quality and consistency of their effort. These are not casual observers. These are people with boats and local knowledge and a commitment of time and resources that has been sustained over weeks. They have walked remote beaches on foot, documenting what they find, knowing that anything they observe might be significant. They have searched the overgrown grounds of abandoned resort properties. They have motored along mangrove edges looking for anything out of place. They have shared their footage and their observations with investigators and with the people following the case, contributing to a collective understanding of the terrain that no single investigative team could build as quickly or as thoroughly. The crowdsourced search for Lynette Hooker is not a replacement for the federal investigation. It is a complement to it. And the two efforts are, in their separate ways, converging on the same place. The search is not finished. The forensic analysis is not finished. The investigation is not finished. What is finished is the possibility that this case goes quietly away, that Brian Hooker's account is accepted without challenge, that the Sea of Abaco keeps whatever secrets it may or may not hold, and that Lynette Hooker's family is left without answers. That possibility ended when CGIS opened a criminal investigation. It ended completely when a federal judge signed a search warrant for Soulmate. It was sealed shut when crime scene tape went up around the boat, and evidence bags came off the deck, and a federal laboratory received its first package of material for analysis. This case is moving forward. It will not stop moving forward. The answer exists. It has existed since the night it was created. It is waiting to be found by the people looking in the right direction. This is not just a story. It is a real life, a real family, and a case that may still have answers waiting to be found. The search for truth continues.